Do you know someone who's a covert narcissist? Well, then this is the video for you. Welcome back to the Mind Strong Edge. In today's video, we're revisiting narcissism. We've done it a few times in the past. We've had an interesting letter from a female viewer, subscriber, and she says, "Dear Mind Strong Edge team, I recently listened to your episode on Narcissistic Personality Disorder, and I really appreciated the way you broke it down clinically, separating traits from actual diagnosis. It was refreshing to hear a discussion that wasn't just throwing around the word narcissist as an insult, but particularly explaining what makes it a disorder." Yes, we did do an episode of that. I think we did a couple actually. And the reason we did those episodes is because we see it a lot. We see it an awful lot. And this term is not just used when we see people in clinic. It's also used very much socially, online and social media, as a way to describe someone's behavior. And it is reasonably, well, it's quite concerning, let's be honest with you, that what is a clinical term, or at least narcissistic personality disorder, let's get that out of the way, that's the clinical term, but a breakdown of that is thrown around so much. Yes, we see it in other areas too. We see OCD thrown around a lot, we see depression, we see a lot of things thrown around where a little bit of information brings the label to bear on someone or someone that you may know, or even on yourself. And it can be very, very dangerous to actually do that because it focuses more on the labeling rather than the actual behavior. So a lot of what we do here is to get to the bottom. As soon as someone comes in and goes, my partner is a narcissist, or I feel like I'm bipolar, or I'm depressed, the first thing we do is we park that label, and then we start looking at the behavior and we work back up from there. So that's really interesting that you've sent that in, because that's exactly what we aim to do with those videos. Go back and have a look at one of our previous videos if you would like to see that. We're not going to recover any of that ground, particularly on narcissistic personality disorder, because if you want to go and have a look at it, you can. She goes on to say, since then, I've been hearing a lot about covert narcissism. And to be honest, I find it confusing. Well, you're not alone on that at all. It seems like every second person is calling their ex or their difficult boss a covert narcissist. And I worry that just like NPD, remember NPD is Narcissistic Personality Disorder, the term is being overused. I'm not really the type of person who likes to slap labels on things, especially when it feels like people are using them to avoid looking at their own behavior. Well, that's a really interesting and insightful perspective. She goes on, but I do want to understand what covert narcissism actually is from a clinical perspective. And that's an interesting question, and we will come to that because we'll come to that. The reason is on my mind because I have had mixed feelings about my own relationship for a long time. I'm in my early 40s and my partner and I have been together for several years. There are times when he's incredibly charming, thoughtful and even supportive, but other times I feel like I'm being manipulated in ways I cannot quite put my finger on. He doesn't explode in anger or lash out in obvious ways, but I often feel undermined, dismissed, or like I have to walk on eggshells to avoid setting him off in subtle ways. I'm just going to hit the pause button there because what you've described in that paragraph is something I think that we see in almost everyone that we see. And that is that you see the problem, if indeed it is a problem. And I don't like to use the word problem because it's a negative label, but let's just use that for the moment. You see a problem from inside the bubble, and it's very, very difficult to have perspective. You're saying here about things that you've experienced, and a lot of things that you experience when you're inside the bubble are not just a product of the other person. It's quite often a product of our interpretation at the time that these things occur, and whether we pay attention to them or not, or whether we are dismissive and we just let it go. And that comes down to a lot of about our own state of mind and where we're at the time that these things occur. And this is why a lot of clinicians will recommend journaling because it's a way, and we talk about this, about writing things down and just getting a smarter view of what's happening. Writing something down in a journal, what happened, how did I feel about it, and what did I do? And just the mere process of writing it down engages a different part of our brain. It causes us to reflect on something and to break it down into a way that we can write it on paper. And then, of course, a little bit later on, when those emotional feelings have subsided, maybe a day or two later, or maybe a week, or whenever it is, you can look at that again, and it just gives you a little bit of perspective, enables you to step outside that bubble for a minute and just have a look back in at what you may have been feeling at the time. A slightly different version of yourself is looking back in and going, that's interesting. I maybe when I wrote this down at the time, or when it happened, it may have been influenced by something else. So I'm just going to say to you now that when you say you can't quite put your finger on it, that's always a bit of a clue that that there are a mashup of emotions coming from different people, and they're bouncing off you inside this. Sometimes it's like an echo chamber. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to extrapolate ourselves from that person and to just look at that person, or even look at ourselves, because quite often we ignore ourselves and we're just looking at that person. But that person could be reacting to us and we're reacting to them, or the environment, or what's happened, what we've brought into that environment. So that's something that we need to be very mindful of going into this, is looking at the environment, looking at the circumstances in which these feelings arose, and just giving them a little bit of chance to breathe, and then looking at them a little bit more critically with our executive functions engaged, which is difficult when you're emotionally charged. I will grant you that. But I just wanted to comment on that paragraph, because that's something that we would immediately, or at least in the first stages of therapy, we would start to look at. We'd say, just throw everything aside for a minute. We don't want to talk about narcissistic personality disorders or covert narcissism. Let's stay totally away from labels for the minute, and let's dig into what's actually happening and try and just make sure that we're clear on that first, very right up front, that we have some clarity on it. If something's happened in the past, this is where cognitive behavioral therapy, you may have heard us talk about this in the past, CBT comes in, because it allows us to go back and just break down what we would call a cognitive distortion, which is exactly what I've just described. It's a distortion that basically has become your reality, and we break it down and we put some devices around that, like the journaling and things like that, to allow you to get a clearer understanding of what's happening. She continues, I found myself wondering if I'm just overthinking things. Yes, maybe you are, but there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all, because it does get things out. If this is just what relationships are sometimes like, or if I'm expecting too much, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I also don't want to ignore my gut if something feels off. Some of the things I've read about covert narcissism, passive-aggressive behavior, playing the victim, subtle manipulation, sound familiar. Yes, they do. Because I think those are the popular traits that we associate with narcissism, certainly socially. But I also know that people can have bad habits without necessarily having a personality disorder. Absolutely. Absolutely right. The key word there is disorder, and when we're talking a disorder, it's a clinical diagnosis, and there is no ifs or buts about it. To label something a disorder, if you're not suitably qualified, can be quite dangerous. So here are my questions. I like this. This is great. What actually differentiates covert narcissism from just being emotionally immature or controlling? I'll just read through those and then we'll just come back to them. But that's a really good question. What differentiates it from just being emotionally immature or controlling? That's a really good question, because I think that a lot of people that start looking at covert narcissism, it's very easy to confuse them and put them all in the same basket. If someone has some of these traits but isn't diagnosable, how should their partner approach it? Another really, really good question. One of the issues that we talked about before, won't go into too much detail with NPD, is that whilst it can be diagnosed, excuse me, by a suitably qualified clinician, it's one of those behaviours that the person who's diagnosed with it more often than not refuses to accept by its very nature. So it can be more damaging to start using the term with someone in this particular case because it's something that they simply will not acknowledge. You can't just say, oh, you're a narcissist, or you're classic NPD, you know, because they will arc up and rally against that with just more vigor. How do I tell the difference between a relationship that is that just has some unhealthy dynamics versus one that is truly damaging? Okay, we'll talk about that too. This is one of those letters where I've actually done some notes, so you'd have to excuse me when I actually read my notes on this, because I wanted to hit these questions quite specifically. I really appreciate the fact that you've written these out like this, and it's a really great place to start. What are some of the signs that can help me trust my own judgment in this situation? Really good question. I really love to hear your take on this. I don't want to jump on a trend or rush to label my partner, but I do want to understand these concepts better. Absolutely, both for my relationship and for how I navigate friendships where people throw around these terms so easily. Thanks for all your work you do. Really appreciate the balanced approach to these topics. Hey, thanks a lot. I'm not going to mention your name, but that is we get some incredible letters. It's just a pity we can't do this more often. But I wanted to do this one because we see this a lot, and we're seeing it more and more and more. I mentioned it before about the fact that people will look up stuff online, and you can do it with AI now. You can have a discussion with ChatGPT, and it will come back and whilst it won't diagnose you, it's clever enough to know that it shouldn't do that. It will give you enough information so that you can actually accept it, which is kind of scary. But look, thank you so much for reaching out. I do want to reference my notes on this and the reason for this is that covert narcissism is what I would call at the moment very much in the pop culture domain. Okay, it is not something that we specifically address or recognize clinically. Okay, that's really, really important right now. I love the fact that you've asked some really good questions. They come from a place of curiosity rather than assumption, which I think is great. And I love the fact that you really have an awareness of the fact that terms are being thrown around in everyday conversation. But unfortunately, it's like a snowball, it gathers momentum, and next thing everyone's using it. And it's very, very easy to start associating yourself with that. So, what is covert narcissism? Well, as I say, it's not something that we can clinically discuss. It's more often described as like a subtle or passive form of narcissism. Narcissism is, in the clinical sense, quite often seen as being grandiose, very, very assertive, very authoritative, whereas covert is sort of more shrouded in shyness. There is a more of a passive entry point into what is seen to be the same behavior, but it's almost shrouded in a diminished, a complete lack of being grandiose about oneself. So the typical narcissist, I think that we probably have people we know in the movies that we could play a narcissist, or we may work for people like that we can just see it, without even witnessing their behavior. We go, overly confident, cocky, controlling, want to always dominate the conversation, narcissist. Now, that's not something that we should actually do, because it's labeling someone, the alpha male perhaps might be quite susceptible to being labeled as a narcissist. But the difference comes from the distinction between these grandiose traits that people with narcissism more commonly have. So a person that displays what we might call covert narcissism will still have a deep need for validation. They still want to feel superior. They have difficulty with empathy, but they might express these in a very less obvious way. And look, I'm going to put it to you that covert narcissism, certainly in a clinical sense, I know you haven't asked this question, but when we talk to people who are particularly who are in a narcissistic relationship, and this is something we do take very seriously, we will look at the traits, how this person feels that they're actually being controlled or responded to, and draw not a conclusive observation, but certainly something approaching that, and then we can start to help that person with escaping or dealing with the relationship. And one of the symptoms of people that are in a narcissistic relationship is they are not aware of it. And this is something that the true narcissist works very, very hard to maintain, is that you do actually feel a sense of security and safety inside the relationship because it is so controlled. But it's only once you start to set the view from outside, it might be someone that said something to you or something that you've just gone, that's just triggering my curiosity, that you start to have an awareness of it. But it takes a lot of time. And when we, I'm going to use the word extract here, extract someone out of the mindset of the narcissistic controlling relationship, and they realize that this is what's happening. For some people, it can be very completely blindside them. And one of the first things we find that people do is they go, how on earth did I not know this? And we have a lot of people that say, I had a gut feeling, I knew it all the way along. How could I be so stupid? Why did I let this happen? And this is a difficult question to answer personally for yourself, because you will end up chasing your tail because you won't find an answer. The answer is in the controlling nature of the narcissist, the way in which they operate. And it's designed to do that sort of thing. It's designed to cocoon you in this relationship that keeps you in place, in state, very specifically. But we do find that people ask this question of themselves: how can this possibly happen to me? Oh my goodness, why didn't I know this? Why didn't I do something sooner? And it can be infuriating and maddening because the answers don't come. So we go out and then we start to look for something that tries to describe what happened to us. But the biggest problem with that is that when we are reading blogs or articles, or particularly stuff like this, which is embedded in pop culture, it's not a clinical paper. It's not a clinical diagnosis. It's more grounded in pop culture. We're reading it through the lens of someone else. We're reading it through their experience. And what we're doing is we're kind of ignoring ourselves in that, and we're basically using someone else's experience to paint over ourselves and give us some closure, if indeed you want closure, or some reasons, or some explanation as to what's happened. But it can be very dangerous because we never actually address ourselves. We're just grabbing someone else's story. We're going, oh, that's me. That's exactly what happened to me. And I put it to you that it probably isn't. But look, some of the ways in which the covert narcissism may manifest is playing victim or using self-pity to elicit attention or controlling situations. Passive-aggressive behaviour, such as making subtly undermining comments or withholding affection. This is different, distinctly different from the very grandiose sort of behaviour that we've talked about before. Extremely sensitive to criticism, while still simultaneously holding a belief that they are uniquely misunderstood or underappreciated. This is taken from, it's not a clinical diagnosis by any chance, but this is just an encapsulation of what we've looked at in terms of trying to understand how people have understood covert narcissism. Engaging in manipulative behaviours, but they're much harder to detect, like guilt tripping, gaslighting, things like that. All symptomatic of narcissistic behaviour in various parts, but they may not actually be a narcissistic personality disorder. But it's very, very easy to take some of those character traits and then label them as covert because they weren't immediately obvious to us at the time. And it gives us that sort of excuse and says, well, it was covert narcissism, therefore, of course I didn't feel it at the time or know it at the time when it was there. But a true narcissist is a master manipulator, and you've got to understand that it's designed to keep you there. So it is important to note that covert narcissism, it's not an official diagnosis. Those points, they're pretty vague at best. Narcissistic Personality Disorder, NPD, is officially recognised. The document that describes and we use consistently for that, it's called the DSM-5, Diagnostics and Statistics Manual. And that details it. But what it also does, and you probably don't need to know this, but it's just worth noting, is that when a diagnosis is performed, you don't just tick it off. You go down and go, yep, okay, I've got all of these, ticks in all the boxes, I'm this. We also do a thing called differential testing because there are a lot of very similar behaviours and also disorders that hover around there as well, and we also need to consider those. So this again is the difficulty of just going narcissism, and just zooming in on that, because it may be something else, and it more often than not probably is. Is covert narcissism a clinical diagnosis? Well, I hope you understand now that absolutely no, it's not. It doesn't downplay it at all, but narcissistic personality disorder is a very specific set of diagnosable criteria. Now, we've talked about this before. It is a grandiose sense of self-importance. And you may think that that has to be very open and very almost theatrical. It sounds theatrical. It doesn't have to be. So whether it's grandiose or whether there's a little bit of something shielding that, a good clinician will see beyond that shielding and see that it is in fact grandiose. There may be a certain shyness that precedes the grandiose sense of self-importance, or the need for admiration, or the complete lack of empathy, but we need to look past those initial presenting behaviours in order to see. But like a master manipulator is going to be good at doing that stuff. That's the thing. Yeah, you can call that covert if you like, but it's just all part of the game if we're dealing with a true narcissist. The other thing to remember is that you can, anyone can actually exhibit symptoms or behavioural symptoms of narcissism and not even be close to being a narcissist. It could simply be that a person has a very strong sense of values, a very strong sense of roles in a relationship, and they're working very hard to maintain that role. And you could see that as controlling. You might go one day, you've always looked after the money, or you've always done that, and then think that it's controlling. But this person, that's all they've ever done. They go, I'm the person that controls the money. That's what I do. And you might wake up one day and say that it's financial abuse, but it could well be. But it could also just be that that's just the behaviour that person felt was necessary to maintain the integrity of the relationship. All right. The labelling itself, as you've raised in this letter, is really, really important. And it's great that you've raised that, because a lot of the time that we spend talking to people, half of that time is getting through putting the labelling aside and actually getting down to the behaviour. I think it's very, very beneficial to understand some of the behavioural patterns of what we may think covert narcissism is, but without a proper diagnosis and with just accepting those, we find ourselves in a really problematic situation, because we're taking what could well be normal behaviour and we're wrapping a pathology or a diagnosis around it. People can act selfishly, be emotionally immature, or struggle with communication without actually having a personality disorder. So it's very, very problematic. It becomes a problem if you start whacking a label on that, where it is simply just normal behaviour. It is characteristic of that person, and it comes from a place. Look, narcissistic behaviour is learned. Okay, it's not inherited. It is a learned behaviour. And if you look at someone and you think that they may be acting in a narcissistic manner, break it down and look at where they came from. Look at where they were kids. Have that discussion with them. See if you can get some information about how they, without trying to play, psychologist or investigator, but have a look at that and understand where they may have learnt that particular behaviour from. We talked a second ago about someone that might be very, very financially controlling. They might have had a family where their dad always controlled the money. He just did it all, and things worked. And this young boy saw that as being what he needs to do too. And it was validated, right? Because it was what his dad did, and that in and of itself validates the behaviour in his mind. Confirmation bias is a very difficult thing. If we start seeing things through a particular lens, and this lens, if we're reading about these topics in social media, then it's someone else's perspective. We're looking at this label through someone else's view. It's very, very easy to interpret what they do as very fitting for us, even when it doesn't. We can be quite liberal with how we associate ourselves with someone else, particularly if they've experienced some strong emotions, and particularly if they've found a way out of it. We almost grab on them as if to say, take me with you, show me what you did, and help me out of this thing. As you pointed out, some people use labels as a way to dismiss their role in a relationship rather than working on healthier communications. And I put it to you that is probably one of the most significant things in rushing to a label, is that, yes, we see a lot of people use a label as an excuse. And there are some, disorders that we see that more than others. But it's very, very... I put it to you that it almost excludes the opportunity to reflect personally once you start labeling something. You go, they're that, and that's that, and I don't need to do anything myself. I don't need to look at myself because they're that. And that is very, very dangerous place to be. So some of the things you can do, so particularly given your concerns, it might be more beneficial for you to think about behaviours rather than labels. And I really think that that's what you've alluded to in your letter. So some of the questions that you could reflect on, and certainly if you're also someone watching this video today that's in a similar place, ask yourself some of these questions. Do I feel like I can express myself freely in this relationship? Or do I often feel silenced or controlled? And again, doing some journaling will help you really answer that particular question. Well, most of these questions, actually, journaling is always good. When I bring up concerns, does my partner engage in open discussions, or do they deflect, manipulate, or make me feel guilty? Do I feel emotionally safe in the relationship? You need to wrap some definition around that, what emotionally safe actually means for you. It's something, of course, that you can sit down and have a chat with a counsellor about in order to just get some clarity around that. Or are you constantly doubting the reality and feelings? Are you being gaslit? Is there some gaslighting going on? Do you feel that your reality is not real? Are you questioning your own view or memory on things? That kind of thing. Are you staying because you see healthy growth and change as a possibility, or because you're hoping that they will change? So some of those questions are things that you really need to dig into prior to just slapping a label on something. And I really caution you about jumping too much on a label, because, as I say, even if it is narcissism, there's a whole stack of other behavioural behaviours that exist around that, and it could be any one of those. And as I said before, these generally fall into a category of behaviours that are learned and validated. So for that person, as an observer, you looking in, you might go, this is not the sort of behaviour that I really appreciate. But for that person, it could simply be normal thing because they've learnt it and it's been validated. As I said, if you feel unsure about these things, reaching out to somebody and sitting down and allowing them to reflect what you're feeling and to give you that view from the outside is going to be really helpful. So, look, it's not a clinical diagnosis, and that really answers that main question I think you had about that. So look, I really put it to you in sort of closing today that instead of focusing on whether someone is a covert narcissist or whether they are even just a narcissist, it may be more useful to focus on the impact of their behavior as you see it on you. Journaling is the best place to start. Obviously sitting down and talking to someone, but just getting a handle on those feelings and the behaviors in a way that you can see them from the outside a few days later or a little bit later. Journaling is amazing. Private, keep it personal, and if you then feel you need to bring that into a session with a counsellor, you can do. If your relationship is causing you ongoing stress and self-doubt or emotional distress, it doesn't sound like that in the letter. It sounds like you're just starting to question these things. Then that's definitely worth addressing, and that's irrespective of whether the label fits or not, because it's about you. Be careful about putting the focus on the other person, because you also need to look after yourself, and you need to look at the impact that it's happening on you. Where is this putting you? And quite often we forget to do that until it's too late, and we actually break down, and we're in a place where it's very, very difficult to recover from. So It's not a selfish thing to always look after yourself first, but certainly consider how the situation is playing out on you. And again, journaling is going to be a great thing that will really help that. Look, I really think what you've done so far is a great step towards understanding the situation better. Keep questioning, keep seeking clarity, and the most important thing is to trust yourself. Trust yourself, and keep a healthy distance away from pop culture, particularly when it comes to this kind of thing, because it will drag you down a rabbit hole that in the end has nothing to do with you. Absolutely nothing to do with you. You can watch other YouTube videos on this, of people talking about their experiences, and it's very, very easy to put yourself in there and go, yep, that's totally me, and next thing you're following them and reliving their trauma vicariously, and it just makes the situation worse. It'll drag you down with it. So my suggestion to you is, and thank you for a wonderful letter too, is to distance yourself from the labels and trust yourself and look at yourself more, get that journaling happening, and just try and get a view of what's happening from the outside. And if you think there are symptomatic behaviours that are there, the question is to ask yourself, have they always been there in your partner? And if they have, and if you start to think that they've always been there, then try to be objective about that, but also try to understand where they may have come from, because these are learnt behaviours. They've been learnt from somewhere and they come from somewhere. And for someone that is in that situation, that's where we would employ something like cognitive behavioural therapy to allow them to understand why they're behaving in a certain way, and to allow them to re-engineer that root cause or that root validation that's given them permission to behave like that, and maybe to look at some other options. Thank you so much for your letter. If you'd like to write into us, the email address is help@mindstrongedge.com. It's in the show notes of this on this YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you if you'd like to write into us. Until next time, this has been the Mind Strong Edge.